right, I think I am live. All right, so we're going to get started. Want to thank everybody for their time this morning, coming to you from some mountain range, maybe the Swiss Alps, perhaps I'm in Tahoe, perhaps I'm in Colorado. I will let you guys certainly take a guess there. Anyways, again, welcome everybody and thank you for joining us this morning, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Today, our panel is going to discuss the stormy waves occurring in our industry around the new consent economy and how leading publishers are taking action on future-proofing their businesses in the ongoing and rising, I would say, regulatory environment around consumer consent. This, as an introduction, regulation wave was initiated out of Europe, which from a US perspective is interesting. We always like to lead. But with the birth of GDPR and now hitting US shores shortly after with CCPA, these laws are only going to get bigger, stronger, and additional measures are starting to come to surface and passage with new laws and regulations. And so with the consumer now having a seat at the table, publishers in the ecosystem have no choice but to take action. So to start off, and before we dive into this fascinating new global economy, let's begin with some introductions for you guys in the audience. First, I'd like to kick off with an introduction to Lila Hunt from System 1. We're also joined by Markus Lauscher from Styria Digital, and also joined by Sebastien Noel from Le Monde. There's Sebastien. All right, thank you guys, welcome. Hope you're not too cold up here on the mountain. So I guess, again, for the introductions, I think it'd be great for the audience as a start for, you guys. I obviously introduced your name, but perhaps you guys could give the audience a little more in terms of your, job description, job title, what you guys do or touch on a day-to-day basis. Lila, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I'm Lila. I'm the head of digital ad strategy for System 1, which is a global company that's primarily focused on US users through the publishing business. And I personally am located in Toronto, just down the street from the North Pole in Canada. And my responsibilities are for all of display monetization across our publishing portfolio. We have howstuffworks.com and mapquest.com if you have ever used those sites.
Thank you, Lila. Markus.
Yes, hi, my name is Markus. I'm from Styria Digital 1. I'm based in Vienna. I'm head of ad technology and strategy in my company. And I was also responsible for rolling out the CMP on all of our platforms.
Thank you, Markus. And Sebastien.
Hi guys, I'm Sebastien. I'm working for Publicité. It's the media sales house for Le Groupe Monde. So obviously with Le Monde, Télérama, Courrier International, Nouvelle Ops, HuffPost.fr, and I'm in charge of Programmatic, Adtech, and Monetization.
Thank you, Sebastien. All right, so let's get started into this world, shall we? I think, to start, kind of this journey, it's worthwhile for us to reverse the clocks a little bit. Let's head back in time just a short while to the time in which, GDPR regulations, right, were no longer just a buzz talked about, maybe this will happen, but now started to become very action orientated. I guess I'll start with, Sebastien, you first. I'd love to get your take, on what business impacts, did your company envision occurring, for the short term, for the long term, when, the regulations started to occur, and as that started to unfold, how were you guys, thinking about that internally at your company?
Thanks. Happy to start with it. So in fact, we thought about what it will change for us, meaning that we will be responsible to get the consent. And the main way we tried to address it at the beginning, in stage 1, is we have to explain it to our users. That's the main topic, is how to explain it to the users. And because of beginning of GDPR v1 and TCF v1, it was easy because we can handle it by ourselves. So we used to build our own CMP at the beginning and to do it by ourselves and to give the consent how we could to the partners. So it was quite easy, obviously, and thanks to the good relationship that the publisher got with the readers, we got really good scores because we had this opportunity to explain why we need the consent really simply and with, let's say, few guidelines. So it was easy at the beginning to explain and to grab the content.
I appreciate that. Markus, obviously you were, you're in Austria, you guys were facing things at the same time. How were you guys, thinking about it or handling it, for your company?
Yeah, it was a big challenge at the beginning because the knowledge at the beginning was not that big and was not that much in the market, and we started to fail forward. Let's call it this way. We implemented a CMP on the CMP on TCF 1.0 at the beginning, and we tried to do our best. And the more or the deeper we dived, the more questions arise. So yeah.
All right. And so Lila, you had, I guess, the luxury, like, I did over in the US of, watching this, train wreck, kind of occurring, given obviously the wave is, crashed on us and, is cascading, across the globe now. What kind of things were going, through your mind or, through the companies in terms of, watching what was happening in Europe, anticipating, with some time that this was likely to hit us as well?
Yeah, I mean, we have some presence in Europe. So we had gone through the process of building a CMP for Europe, and it was based off the AppNexus framework. So it was pretty easy for us to get up and running. And then as CCPA started to get established, it became very unclear how the US would evolve their privacy legislation, because the US is made up of, basically all the governing bodies for each of the states. The direction it looks like it's heading is that every state will have its own potential legislation, versus in GDPR, where you guys have some unification across the legislation across respective countries. So for us, to be honest, it's really terrifying to think of having to manage different rules in different states, especially since, in terms of a tech deployment perspective, we're not looking at what the user state is and then determining whether to issue consent. We kind of have the CMP deployed at a country level. So it's technically really, really scary.
So, that's kind of an interesting point, right? Because, I hear, and obviously, my next kind of question for you guys that naturally is, I hear CMP, but, clearly, this would beg the question that this might also impact, other areas, of your ad stack in general. And so, with those, again, ongoing, regulatory requirements, how is this impacting, or how has it impacted your, the ad stack that you guys, maybe used to have and now are, evolving into for yourselves? I'll open for who would like to take it.
I know for me personally, I'm starting to prefer solutions that may handle consent with individual partners. So if you look at Google or Amazon wrapper, because the bidder connections are server side, there's kind of a single point of entry, versus header bidding is a little more vulnerable, I feel, just because we have to manage each of those partners individually. It can be really challenging, again, especially because we built our own CMP. Not necessarily all the partners are receiving consent properly or in the way that they would expect. So we have to troubleshoot that individually with each vendor.
Actually, Sebastien, this, it reminds me of the conversation, we had, where you mentioned that, for your team, there was a moment that you guys hit where you realized that, you needed to have a different conversation, with the users. And I think this was right around the time that, TCF version 2, kind of unfolded. Mainly, right, because you wanted, and I'll kind of quote you a little bit, but I want to hear more for you to share to the audience. But you mentioned I have to have a different conversation with the users because I need them to give me consent so I can pay my journalists right at the end of the day, and everybody continues with the quality journalism. The floor is yours. I'd love for you to share more upon that for the audience, because I think it's very critical.
Yes, in fact, so this summer with TCF v2, we faced many things. We were waiting for CNIL, so French regulation, for the new recommendations. We had a V2 of these recommendations. We were pending to the validation of this V2. So everybody was quite afraid to see a button, mandatory button, saying, no, we're close to the yes. And I want to get in many parameters that I want. So this used to be something really complicated for us. And we were facing a moment where we had to go TCF v2 during summer, even though if we were aware of it since months. But we had to explain to the publisher, as a media sales house, then the consent is not only for the ads. So giving the consent will be valid also for the subscribers funnel, for some solution in order to enhance the website. And that TCF v2 is a kind of vehicle who could take everything in charge. So that used to be the internal conversation. But because of TCF v2, which is a good thing for the ad business markets, we were also facing a mandatory way to get the consent. And so we have to show all the purposes and to give, with the EAB wording, the way to explain the user why we need this and that consent, etc., etc. So this was quite complicated, in fact, to find the good balance versus the stuff that we were doing before, explaining really on an editorial way why we need consent. And TCF v2, which was quite violent, explaining all the different consent that we need, giving the way to, let's say, choose in every purposes and see all the partners. So we implemented TCF v2. So we moved from a homemade CMP to a platform. We saw, honestly, a drop in web perf, which was quite dramatic. No issues at all on the ad perf, because we get a really great scent of consent. But we saw the numbers really decreasing on consent. And so we decided quietly soon to move back on our own CMP, because we really need to explain to the users why we need their consent. Spoiler alert, we are thinking to move on cookie wall politic, in order to say that if you as a user would like to access the content, you will have or to subscribe or to give the consent on the ad. This way, we'll also move TCF v2 on a secondary page. And so we'll set back the conversation with the user on our way. Move all the tech issue that we could have on the load time of the web page, and get back in the conversation. So yes, that's the pain that we faced in the conversation, and that's why we think that we lost consent, because it was too complicated at the moment. And to be honest with you, in France, the regulation recommendation say that from March 31, scroll and click will not ever be something that they would like to get as a consent. So it will be click on yes, no, or get off the web page. And so we decided to implement it yet a month ago. So we already have some figures about it. So yes, that's something that we have to face because of TCF v2 as a framework, but mostly because of these new regulation recommendations.
Markus, your same market, how has this impacted you the same way, or did you guys experience this differently?
Yeah, it was nearly the same thing. Well, we were faced with nearly the same things Sebastien already said. I think the most important or the most the biggest challenge for us was to get the knowledge of all the vendors for what we, or for whom we collect the consent. So to talk to the agencies, to talk to the clients, to the buyers, so that they tell us which vendors they use. This was the one thing, to get a full picture of the ecosystem or of the tools that are used. The same thing also was mentioned with what happens on the website. So all the embed codes. Yeah, for example, we had the case that on one of our websites, an embed from New York Times was included, and this embed dropped 11 cookies. So yeah, you have to take care about those too. And the thing also regarding the consent quotes and so on, we did some A/B testing. We did some tests on how we implemented the CMP. We started with the classic bar at the bottom or the top of the website, and there we saw that the, let's say, do not care users are very high. So users who do not interact with the consent banner, but consume the content. So the improvement was that we now have some kind of pop-up that is put over the website, and where the user has to interact with the consent banner to consume the content. To consume the content. And we also implemented some kind of conditional firing. So just at the moment where the user interacts, the ad server and all the other technical partners or technical scripts are loaded. So yeah, there have been a lot of work and a lot of things that was impacted, but as I said, we are moving forward, and we go it step by step.
I appreciate that, Markus. Lila, did you, have you faced, similar, challenges in your role? I know there was a conversation we had where, you were mentioning, you try to do the right thing early with your CMP, then that ended up getting deprecated. And so it becomes, a bit of this, juggling act and, kind of scary moment, right, for your future set. Love for you to, chime in, obviously, and add, more as to the challenges you were also facing.
Sure. So we had a third party running on some of our properties, and we had our own in-house CMP running on some other properties. The third party would continually push changes to their library that broke all monetization in EU. So that was just like really challenging for the credibility of like outsourcing to a third party for consent management. We ended up completely shifting strategy back to our internal built CMP and resourcing it. And AppNexus deprecated the library, like the open source library. So now we have a CMP that's built off a deprecated library, and we are solely responsible for navigating and interpreting changes to the legislation, not only in Europe, but also in the US and anywhere else in the world it evolves. And it's really hard because it involves kind of this mix of professionals across legal, compliance, my role in monetization, who we're not, like, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert in these things, but we have to try and interpret the evolving legislation and respond with technologies now that we're building ourselves. So it feels to me like there is an element of risk, not only from maintaining technically a solution, making sure that it's working and that all the users are getting the options they need and the vendors are getting the signals that they need, but also from like a legal liability perspective, it's really hard to navigate.
Lila, do you feel then that there, maybe is conversations that are not happening that should be happening with, the either, the publisher vetting, a tech partner or, something that should be, kind of asked or challenged? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I would say one of the things I think a lot about is like where the future of consent is going. Right now, where I would say historically, I think most people think about consent and collecting consent in terms of cookies, and a lot to do with third-party cookies, because those are the ones that are following you around the internet. And there are many vendors now that are trying to kind of subvert, I think, the intention of the legislation, which is to stop companies from following people around the internet. And so as I'm going through partnerships, especially when it comes to data partnerships, they're very vague and gray, hard to navigate legal, because the concepts that we're establishing terms over don't even necessarily exist yet, or they exist within a construct we're used to that's going to be deprecated when third-party cookies are deprecated. So I'm trying to do my best to think about what would it mean if we're managing consent from users' emails from newsletters, for example. Is there consent if somebody subscribes to a newsletter? I don't have like a T's and C's with that user, and then I'm using their email address to track their behavior. Does a pop-up on the website kind of like necessitate consent? It's really, really challenging to think about, because I know as a user, if I signed up for a newsletter, I would not assume I'm also signing up to be tracked by advertisers. So
if I just can add a word, if it's fine, Joe, I think that we're forgetting something. Even though if the interest is to speak about Adtech and digital media, but I think that talking to the publisher, and I just got a conversation 30 minutes ago with one of the publishers we're working with, we're just forgetting that consent is not only for ads. So that's the first step. And I think that even though if I'm really happy of what AIB has done with TCF V2, which is a great tool, but they just forgot to speak with the publisher, in fact, and to explain publishers that consent is not only available for ads. So that's the first step. And another one, which is really important, even though if most of ad tech companies are based on cookies to display ads, it's not because you don't have any consent that you cannot display ads. So in fact, it's just became in the global mind of people that CMP is an ad blocker, in fact. And that's really the conversation that we should address now, even though, so I mostly in France, we're moving in March to this reject all button. So on every website, you're going to have a pop-up, as you said, and not even a banner. It's going to be a pop-up on the website saying, if you want to get in, you have to give your consent. And you can say no, but we have to think about get back in the conversation with publishers, and so get back in the conversation with users that it's about your privacy and your personal data, but not only about ads. And you could be in touch with the ads on the website if the publisher and the media sales house is using a tech which is able to deliver ads without cookies. And most of the time, I think we just forgot this.
Yeah, I will piggyback on that one more point. Like the other thing that came up internally as we were navigating TCF 2.0, TCF 2.0 is not the legislation. The legislation hasn't necessarily changed. TCF is just the extension or the interpretation of the legislation extended to a protocol. So like when we were going through TCF upgrades, it was really, really challenging because we lost consent rates due to, as you mentioned, the complexity. And we had to kind of dial it back and say like, okay, there's really only one partner that's requiring us to be TCF 2.0. So how much of a priority, or like how much of a, how do we approach this and how do we interpret it? Because again, like having a CMP, we have to get the CMP approved by the IAB. So so that was a bit of, I think, an epiphany that helped us change the way we look at managing the tech.
So question then off of this. So it seems to me, right, that you guys are evolving into, you know, a world where, you know, you're having a different conversation with obviously the user direct, right? That's where you guys are headed for yourselves. But, you know, Sebastien, you mentioned something, you know, it makes me wonder then if you're going to have a reject all button, right? Then surely, right, there's going to be people that hit that button. How are you guys thinking about, you know, that, or anticipating that from a strategy, right? Like, obviously it wouldn't be beneficial to you to just accept, right, reject, you know, all button. Like, are you guys thinking about, you know, strategies or tactics to, you know, maybe, you know, evoke value to the user, so therefore you'll get, you know, them to consent? Or if they do say no, like, do you have strategies later on? Like, how are you guys thinking about, you know, which will be maybe an evolving conversation with the user?
So we have to get in conversation with the user and the regulation, because we cannot do what we want. We have to respect the regulation, which is quite complicated because it's not always so clear as it should be, let's say. So we're trying to navigate between this. Stuff which is also interesting is that at Le Monde Group, we have many publishers. So let's say that on Le Monde, which is really premium, we can decide to get in a cookie wall saying that they have to subscribe or to give them consent if they want to access. And if you're not happy with this, okay, that's fine with us. You're going to go for another website, another publisher, but we think that the content is really qualitative, so you have to pay in a way for this. So that's why we're trying to move on. On other websites like Noel, which is a magazine and is not, let's say, so big than Le Monde, we cannot give this possibility to the user. So what we're trying to do, and we're already trying to do it, if you are going on novelops.com and you reject consent, on the webpage, you're going to have a banner saying, hey, you didn't give your consent. You know what? You're on a website who's paying journalists, who's trying to bring you qualitative news and information. So could you please reactivate your consent or subscribe? And then we have a free website like post.fr, and we know that we cannot do this because if we are doing this, we're going to lose the people who are not so involved and subscriber like on the other website. So we have to think about the best way to address this kind of users. So it's just now when we're talking. So if you are going to lemonde.fr and novelops.com, you're going to see that if you reject all, even though we don't have the button at the moment, you're going to have this pop-up or big banner. It covers at least 30% of the screen on desktop, mostly 50 on mobile, because that's something that is mandatory for us. And as I said, it's not only mandatory for ads, even though if it's important, but it's also mandatory in order to improve the website, the conversation with the user, and the funnel of subscribers. But it's quite complicated to find the good way to try it, because when you're among other stuff that you're doing is on Twitter, on LinkedIn, etc. People are doing some screenshots. Say, hey, what you're doing this? You have to take care in the conversation with your subscribers, because you have to explain what you're doing this. And on top of that, because we are just talking about TCF and the way to get consent, but we also realized that with our friends of Apple and iOS, when you have traffic coming from Facebook, Twitter on iOS, they're using Safari. And so you have, let's say, beginning of issues with cookie third parties. And because we're using a third party CMP, we have to get the consent every 7 days at least now. And if iOS 14 is going on, it's going to be every day. And when you're somebody in the media, you're aware of it, you know, you're clicking, etc. But when you're a user, you're going to be fed up of this. Clicking every day on every website all the time, etc. So that's why we're trying to move on our own CMP to get first-party cookies, let's say, push on the side the TCF v2, really using it as a tool, not only as the main platform of grabbing consents, and get back this conversation explaining the user why we need their consent. But it's not easy.
So I appreciate that. So now, is that making you guys, and the collective you guys as all of you on stage today, you know, are you thinking about different models? Like, you know, Sebastien, you talked about it, right? Like, it's not just about ads. You know, how are you guys thinking about, you know, are you other, you know, forms of, you know, revenue diversification for yourselves, e-commerce, or, you know, I don't know, like, how are you guys thinking about that, or are you at all?
Yeah, I think it's all, or it's covered. It should cover all those topics. So every where cookies or similar technologies like cookies are used to identify users, you have to get the consent from the user. So it does not mind if this is an ad or a formula for buying something, or a shop, or whatever. You have to give the consent, or you have to get the consent, and it's absolutely the thing. You have to think about how to talk to the users and how to explain the users all the things Sebastien said, how to explain the users why it is necessary to give the consent, or to have the consent, or to get the consent. And I think a really big thing is to bring all the stakeholders that are involved in this process, or in this thing, bring all the stakeholders together. And this is legal, this is sales, this is marketing. Those are the users, and it's the Adtech industry.
If I can add something, sorry, but I'm going to give you an example which is really weird, and we never thought about it before September. So we're using Dailymotion as a player, but I know that it's the same for YouTube. And in fact, we had issues because Dailymotion is dropping cookies. Is dropping cookies in order to run the player only. So in order to respect GDPR and regulation, we had to develop a layer above the player for people who deny all, saying, hey, we're sorry, but because you decided to deny cookies, you cannot see the video. So if you want to see the video, you have to allow cookies. That is crazy. That is crazy.
It's the same at us. Yeah, we also invented some kind of conditional logic where we did the overlay, or exchanged the real content through the overlay, or through this information overlay, so that the user has to give the consent, or has to accept, or has to change his privacy settings, that he can see the content. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this from like the perspective of how do we drive value to an advertiser? So, you know, in a world where let's assume we don't have cookies and we've got, like, as a publisher, I've invested in getting an email relationship and I have consent for that user. That becomes the most valuable asset as a publisher I have for an advertiser. And so I believe we're going to be going back to like a rate card model for that type of offering for an advertiser, because again, that's the value that's going to continue paying for the publishing business and allow me to, you know, keep paying editors and things like that. And then kind of the fallback from that, which for, you know, my portfolio is going to be 90% or more of our users are probably not going to give us their emails. There's not a huge incentive to give your email to look at like a kind of a fun article, right? So for the other 90%, how do I deliver attribution back to the brand? And I can only do that by delivering a click. And I don't necessarily need to cookie the user in order to do that. I can use signals I understand about my content and about the behavior or the interaction on the page to try and help deliver the advertiser an engaged user. And then when I do that, the advertiser from there has a first party relationship with the person that they've kind of landed on their site.
So I think this is a great shift, right? Because I think we can all agree, or it seems we agree, that consent, right, is the door opener. But there's another topic that we, you know, have touched a little bit, and I want to dive on it a little bit, you know, deeper, which is, you know, third-party cookie death, foregone conclusion, right? We're entering now this other world where first-party data, you know, will be, it could be the golden ticket as I see it in terms of, you know, rebalancing this conversation, Lila, as you mentioned, between brand, you know, publisher. Now, during this, you know, moment in time, I think it's worth addressing for the audience, right? IDs, this, you know, everybody's, you know, IDs are popping up all over the place, right? We have ID5, TTD has one, LiveRamp has one. What's your take on, you know, the IDs, you know, of the world? What's your opinion?
So for me, I feel they have a significant potential for data leakage if I am not a publisher with a really large set of matching. So a lot of the identity links that are happening today are still based off cookies. And I feel like there's a mad race to cookie as many users as possible right now, so that in the future, it can, you know, persist as a first party cookie, which again is kind of an interesting and high risk strategy. Like who's to say that when third party cookies are deprecated, Google doesn't flush all of the third-party cookies that were established prior to that date, right? Like we don't actually know that that strategy is going to drive long-term value, but sure, it doesn't necessarily hurt today, and it's how the internet today is working. So it's not a huge risk from a monetization perspective because it's already happening. But in the future, if I have, let's say, 10% of my users have an email link, and I'm feeding data back into an identity solution for the 10%, I probably don't have the scale against those users to receive the benefits of that ID from a monetization perspective. So then it becomes who is benefiting off of the data that I'm supplying into this identity solution. There's also a technical challenge because, like, as it stands today, I now have to go back and look at tag managers because there's just too many tags on the page. And I think we're going to see like resurgence of tag managers. The importance of client-side header bidding will be mitigated because, you know, you don't need to do a cookie match in the client side anymore. So potentially my theory is like header bidding starts to shift server to server, finally, thank goodness. But we have all of these identity solutions or first party DMP like solutions that need to be managed on the client side. And that is rough from a tech perspective.
How do you feel about that, Sebastien or Markus?
Yeah, the ID topic is a big one that comes up to us. I'm not sure in which direction it will go, because for a publisher, it is really, or for the publishers, it's really difficult to decide which ID provider is the right one. And which ID provider also is used by the clients or by the buyers, so that the match can happen. I think there will be a lot of discussions in the near future about this.
Okay, I appreciate that. So we only have a couple minutes, left. I'll try to maybe keep a little bit of time for questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, certainly you can type them in. Let's maybe do some quick roundtable, towards the end of this. So, for the publishers that might be sitting, in the sidelines or in the audience right now, listening on this, what guidance, would you guys offer to them, right? What would you like them, to know or to consider, either, challenges, tribulations? Go.
Honestly, I think that first of all, you have to think twice before doing something with content, because you have a lot of promises on what you could do in terms of ad spend if you get the consent. And so we used to see let's say average number of vendors trying to set, or the publisher asking the publisher to set legitimate interest. And it is something really weird. In fact, why did me as a publisher will need to ask legitimate interest to set up ads? It's complicated, and how I could justify this, and I could justify this more or less to the regulation, okay, fine, but to the user, in fact, because of course 95% of the user are not looking at the details, and tomorrow it will be easy, it will be yes or no, so one click. But now they are checking, and so I think that we have to think twice because of this kind of stuff, and also because if you're making big changes on the CMP, you have to reload all the consent in order to grab it for all the people. So if you make a mistake on your CMP, you forgot a big vendor, you have to set back the big vendor. And so you have this choice saying, okay, all the new one will get the consent, but all the guy that I'm grabbing consent since 2 months, I have to reset. And is it a risk for me to reset all my consent and go from zero? And the possibility to go from 80% of consent, that's what we have today at Le Monde, to 70 or 60 maybe. So that is something really complicated. And I think that, yes, it's complicated because it's tech, legal, and business. And so, yes, I really think that even though if it takes time, thinking twice before doing something, that's the advice I will give.
All right, go ahead, Lila.
In 10 seconds or less, I will say continue encouraging your internal stakeholders and your vendors to think beyond cookies when it comes to consent management and value of consent. We have to start thinking and preparing for what comes next. And unfortunately, in this respect, we're kind of throwing technologies at the wall right now and seeing what stick, and they won't stick until the cookie actually goes away.
Thanks, Lila. Markus, any knowledge you can drop in 10 seconds or less?
Yeah, I think the one sentence I could say is, it's not set in stone, it's just written on paper. And you have to be aware what happens next, and to be always informed what happens on the website, to offer the users the right information.
Thank you, Markus. I do have one question from the audience. The question was, what will be the tactics to get back consent from users after they first rejected it?
So on my side, I would say explain why you need it, in fact, and don't think that consent is something that you ask once when they're getting in your website, but you have to get in the conversation. So if maybe if it's not done at the moment, say thank you if it's giving you your consent, or maybe explain afterwards when he's on the website why you need it, in fact, and just show that you've seen that he didn't give the consent, and say, hey, it seems that you didn't give the consent. Here is why I'm needing it. I think that's the best way, in fact, explaining the user why you need it. It's just not a new pop-up that we're having on browser, like, do you want to enable notification? Do you want to subscribe to my newsletter? And sometimes there's too many, but yes, something like that.
All right. There was another question, which was, do you think cookieless third parties and non-consent will be on top of publishers' attention for 21, or is there still room to develop features, products based on third-party cookies before they are deprecated by Google in 2022?
I personally don't think there's a lot of value in developing new solutions for third-party cookies. It's hard to say what the drop dead date will be for the actual deprecation, but there are enough solutions in market, I think, already that are third-party based, that if you're looking for like yield nuggets over the next year to 2 years, let's say, just outsource it for now and find a vendor.
All right. Well, next question. Is CCPA already being enforced by buyers?
Yep. Yeah, it's enforced by the tech companies, similar to how GDPR is. So the main difference, which has been beneficial up to this point, is it's opt-out. So we really only have to stick a link on the website that gives user the ability to opt out if they go looking for the opt-out link. So you can assume like our opt-in rates are like 99.9%. I think we've maybe had one user opt out like ever. So that's been much easier from a monetization perspective. But the legislation around that is even evolving and changing. And I think the US is going to go through a maturing based off of the work that's already been established in Europe. Canada too. Canada is coming.
All right. I do believe we unfortunately are out of time. So I want to thank you guys, Markus, Sebastien, Lila, for joining me on stage. And again, thank you to the audience for attending. Hopefully, a good knowledge drop occurred for you today. Thank you guys. Be well.
Bye.
Bye.